On the 18th of October 2009, 39-year-old Dawn Viens stormed out of the restaurant she owned with her husband of 13 years. The couple had just ended yet another disagreement over money. But this time, something was different. Dawn took her phone and her purse, but left her car behind. She was never seen alive again. Dawn Viens was born and raised in Vermont, the same state where she would eventually meet her future husband David. Their love story is far removed from that of a fairy tale. David was a father of one and was going through a difficult divorce when he first met Dawn. Despite the challenges of starting a new relationship in the midst of a separation, Dawn stuck by her man. When she was introduced to David's daughter Jackie, she treated her like her own child. Once the paperwork on the divorce was settled, the couple married and moved to Florida for a fresh start. But Florida didn't sit right with either of them. Since the time they first met, they shared a dream of opening a restaurant together one day. David Viens was already an accomplished chef, so when the opportunity came to open their own place in Los Angeles, they jumped at the chance. They packed everything they owned and settled into a new life in Alameda, a quiet suburb known for its low crime rate. In 2008, they proudly opened the doors to Time Contemporary Cafe. David took to the kitchen like a seasoned pro. He served up dish after dish while Dawn put her bubbly personality to work as the hostess and front of house. The restaurant appeared to be a success, at least initially. But by the time they hit the 1-year mark, the realities of running a business and maintaining their romantic relationship began to take a toll. The stress of long hours, financial strain, and the blending of professional and personal lives began to erode on what had drawn them together in the first place. 6 months later, Dawn walked out of the restaurant and was never seen again. At least, that's what everyone believed. 3 weeks after Dawn was last seen, her sister Dana contacted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to report her missing. But she wasn't the first to notice that Dawn had seemingly disappeared into thin air. Across the road from the Time Contemporary Cafe was a motorcycle repair shop owned by Joe Casey. Every day, Dawn would drop into the shop on her way to work to chat with Joe and to play with his dog. So when Dawn didn't turn up on the 19th of October, he immediately thought something was odd. When she didn't show up the next day either, he started to become concerned. 2 days later, he saw David at the restaurant and went over to speak to him. Naturally, Joe was concerned about his friend's well-being, so he asked David where Dawn was. The response couldn't have been more odd. David told Joe that he had fired Dawn. Yes, you heard correctly, he had fired his wife. Joe left the conversation with an uneasy feeling. For the next couple of weeks, he kept watch on the restaurant to see if he could spot Dawn. He saw her vehicle, but he never saw her. But what he did see was some odd behavior, mainly by David. Joe watched David and his daughter Jackie use the restaurant rubbish bins to dispose of women's clothing, some of which Joe recognized as belonging to Dawn. Then he noticed David arriving and leaving with a new woman on his arm, and the pair seemed to be more than just casual acquaintances. None of David's behavior indicated anything sinister had happened to Dawn, but it did make Joe question if there was more to the situation. Still, it was only when another of Dawn's friends came to the shop and began to voice her concerns about not having seen her friend for weeks that he decided to do something about it. Joe and the friend visited the Los Angeles PD to report her missing, but the officers told her that the report could only be filed by a family member. As soon as Dawn's friends contacted Dana, she went to the police station in person to report her sister missing. By then, it was November 9th, more than 3 weeks since Dawn was last seen by anyone other than her husband. 2 days later, David was interviewed by a detective specializing in missing persons from the LA County Sheriff's Office. In his recorded statement, he stated that Dawn had run away after he had asked her to go to rehab for a drinking and drug problem. She had since texted him to say she needed space, which he intended to give her. When he was asked why he hadn't reported his wife missing after 3 weeks, he said he had considered it but wanted to respect Dawn's request for privacy. Later that same week, David told investigators that he had received a call from Dawn as well as several messages. He showed officers a message which said she wanted to clear her head for a little while, but she loved him and Jackie and would return when she was ready. It was these messages which prompted officials to look a little closer at Dawn's phone records. They also checked her credit card and bank account to determine if any had been used since Dawn was last seen. There was no activity on her credit card or bank account, but in the week since she had last been seen, Dawn's phone had sent a number of text messages to her friends, her husband, and a handyman who occasionally carried out work at the restaurant. The text messages all ran along the same lines. Dawn was okay, she was taking time to think things over, and she would get in touch when she was feeling better. One of these messages stated she was in Florida, except Dawn wasn't in Florida, a fact that officials discovered when they looked at which cell phone towers were routing the text messages. None of the towers were in Florida. All of them were in California, and all of them were located near the Time Contemporary Cafe, which meant Dawn had never left. So where was she? By this point, the red flags in the case were growing. A wife had been missing for 3 weeks. Her phone had been sending messages but not from where its user stated, and her cards and account hadn't been accessed. The evidence was concerning, but it would take several more bombshells for the truth to come to light. The first of these revelations came from one of Dawn's closest friends. She had been receiving text messages up until the 5th of November, but she immediately suspected they weren't legit because of one significant factor. Dawn's nickname to her friends was Pixie, spelled P-I-X-I-E, except the messages were all signed off with Pixie, spelled P-I-X-Y. When officials spoke to the handyman from Time, he dropped another bombshell. He stated that while at the restaurant, David had told him that he thought Dawn was stealing money from him, and if that was true, he was going to kill that bitch. This statement, combined with David's odd behavior during his interview, brought him under even more intense scrutiny from investigators, especially when they ran a background check. David had an extensive police record, including several arrests and time in prison for and distribution both in Florida and Vermont. It didn't take long for officials to connect the dots. The Time Cafe was running at a loss, and yet the bills were still being paid, which indicated David had been selling drugs to support the cost of running the restaurant. During the second interview with police, David was asked to take a polygraph test. He agreed and a date was set, but when it came time to sit in the chair, he refused. After that, the case seemed to stall. There were no new leads and no indication as to where Dawn had disappeared to. Meanwhile, David continued to run the restaurant as if nothing had changed. He appointed a new hostess and continued his business as if nothing had happened. A few months into 2010, a reporter from the Daily Breeze visited Time to interview David about his wife's disappearance. David refused to answer any questions and stated that he had been told not to talk about it, but he did make one confession. When he was asked, "Do you love your wife?" he responded, "I loved my wife. I miss her. I wanted to put up a cash reward, but I'm broke." It was the use of the word loved with a D, as in past tense, which the reporter highlighted in his write-up of the interview. By August 2010, Dawn's disappearance had been formally transferred from the missing persons team to the homicide division of the LA Sheriff's Department. As part of the reclassification, all of Dawn and David's friends, employees and witnesses were all interviewed again. That's when officials learned from Joe, the motorcycle shop owner, about David's new love interest and the strange behavior in the days after Dawn was last seen. He also told them that Dawn had confessed David could be violent and controlling at times. When detectives heard about the bins outside the restaurant being used to get rid of women's clothing, they spoke to David's 25-year-old daughter Jackie to find out more. She recalled how David had told her that Dawn had left and she was never coming back. Joe and Jackie's statement prompted officials to set up surveillance on David's apartment, but they quickly learned that he no longer lived there. He had moved in with his new girlfriend Kathy Galvin, a 22-year-old waitress from Time Restaurant, the same woman Joe had seen on David's arms in the weeks after Dawn's disappearance, and the same woman David had put into her position as hostess. On the 1st of October 2010, a search warrant was secured to take a closer look at David and Dawn's apartment. Investigators found blood splatter throughout the apartment, but when it was processed for DNA, it had deteriorated to a point at which it was unusable. Still, it was enough to indicate that Dawn had likely been murdered by her husband. But a hunch wasn't going to cut it in a court of law, so detectives shifted their focus to watching David's new apartment. At the same time, they posted a new flyer about Dawn's disappearance, but this time, they stated the case was now a homicide. The change in the classification had the desired effect on David. He notified the police that Dawn had been calling him again to tell him she was fine. It was clear that the renewed interest in the case was spooking him, and David was beginning to crack. But in the end, it wasn't David who cracked the case wide open. It was his own daughter, Jackie. Jackie Viens was David's daughter from a previous relationship. In late 2010, her boyfriend contacted investigators to tell them Jackie knew something about Dawn's disappearance. But when they tried to contact her, she seemed to have disappeared as well. In the end, officials flew to South Carolina to speak to her, but once again, she was nowhere to be found. Ultimately, it took until February 2011 for Jackie to contact them and agree to be formally interviewed. What she had to say changed everything. Here's her version of events. Not long after Dawn went missing in 2009, Jackie and David were drinking at the apartment they shared. Eventually, they got talking about where Dawn had gone, which was when David admitted he knew exactly what had happened to his wife. He told Jackie they had been fighting a lot, especially about money. Dawn was unrelenting, and when he tried to get away from her to get some space, she wouldn't leave him alone. So he pushed a dresser up against the bedroom door to lock her out. Somehow, Dawn still managed to get into the bedroom, which sent David into a fit of rage. So just like any self-respecting person would do, he tied her up and taped her mouth shut with clear packing tape. He left her like that on the kitchen floor for the rest of the night while he went to bed. When David woke up the next morning, he realized Dawn was dead, probably from choking on her own vomit. He told Jackie he had thrown Dawn's body out with the trash and that her remains would never be found. Jackie also admitted to investigators that David had convinced her to send text messages from Dawn's phone after she went missing. Just before the interview ended, Jackie commented that David had once joked that the best way to get rid of a body would be to cook it. It was a chilling thought, and one that stuck in the minds of the detectives. When the interview was over, Jackie immediately called her father to admit to him she had told the police everything she knew. Neither of them knew that David's phone was being tapped at the time. David hung up the phone but called back a short time later to tell her not to speak to anyone and that his lawyer would be in touch soon. That was the moment when detectives knew for sure they had their man. While the case might seem cut and dry at this point, there were many twists and turns still to come. 5 days after Jackie's police interview, officers followed David as he drove his SUV towards Rancho Palos Verdes in South Los Angeles County. They watched as he pulled into a parking area near the cliff's edge and exited the vehicle. When Kathy got out of the passenger seat, the couple began fighting both physically and verbally. Deputies ran towards the scuffle and ordered them to stop fighting, but David broke away, hopped over a chain-link fence and jumped feet first over the cliff. Miraculously, he was still alive when rescuers reached him and he was airlifted to hospital. The fall severely injured David, but he survived. 5 days after attempting to take his own life, David was interviewed by police in his hospital bed. After initially refusing to talk, he finally admitted what Jackie had already told them. He had taped Dawn's mouth shut and found her dead in the morning, but he refused to tell them what had happened to her body. No matter what approach they tried, David wouldn't budge. Even though the case was missing the final detail, there would finally be enough to charge David with Dawn's death. In a last-ditch attempt to find Dawn's body, officials tore down the walls and floor of the Thyme restaurant. The search turned up no new evidence, and there was no sign of Dawn's remains. It was looking like David's claim that no one would ever find her would be proven true. To the investigators' surprise, 5 days after David's hospital interview, he appeared to have a change of heart. He rang the lead detective to make a recorded statement about what had happened to Dawn's remains. This is where an already disturbing case gets truly sickening. David was a chef, so he knew exactly what happens to meat when you cook it for long enough. First, it goes soft, then the fibers begin to break down, which makes it tender before it finally turns into mush. David decided this was a perfect way to get rid of a human body, render it down to nothing. He put her body into a 55-gallon drum, filled it with water, and in his words, "I just slowly cooked it, and I ended up cooking her for 4 days." When he strained the drum, the only identifiable part of Dawn was her skull, which he had hid in his mother's home. He threw what was left of his wife out in 5-pound lots with the kitchen waste at the restaurant. David was charged with first-degree murder, but despite his confession, which was recorded over 3 separate interviews, he pleaded not guilty. In September 2012, his trial got underway in Los Angeles. David's injuries from the jump off the cliff were so severe that he appeared in court in a wheelchair and wearing a back brace. The first witness to take the stand was Jackie, and she repeated exactly what she had told officials during her interview. It was a compelling testimony, but the defense tore her story apart. Eventually, she was forced to admit she had smoked the night of David's confession and that her memory was somewhat fuzzy. She also agreed that she had never seen David or Dawn have a physical fight, although she was aware her stepmother had a drinking problem. Friends of Dawn testified that she had told them her husband was physically abusive and that she had been stashing money away to leave David. The worker from the restaurant testified that he had heard David say he wanted to kill that bitch. When it came time for David's lawyers to present their defense, they claimed that the story about getting rid of Dawn's remains by cooking was ludicrous. They asserted that at the time of the call, David was heavily under the influence of pain medication and his story couldn't be taken seriously. But the evidence made it clear that the story wasn't going over well with the jury. Ultimately, they handed down a guilty verdict after just 5 hours of deliberations. Immediately after the verdict, David fired his lawyers. David didn't testify in his own defense during the trial, so the first the jury heard from him was when he gave a rambling 40-minute statement during his sentencing hearing. He admitted that he had murdered Dawn, but that the story he told the police about stewing the cadaver was a lie, and he hadn't been thinking clearly when he spoke to officials. "I loved my wife. I didn't cook my wife." He also stated that he deserved a new trial. The sentencing judge declined David's request, and he handed down a sentence of 15 years in prison. In 2021, David applied for early release. As part of the parole board hearing, he was grilled about his life history, including claims that he was by an older woman when he was 12, mistreated by a tyrannical father, became involved in dealing as a teenager, and landed in prison for trafficking. He also describes his 2 marriages, drug addiction, depression, and how he realized in therapy since the killing that he was a controlling and jealous husband. "I'm so sorry for what I've done. I regret it. I will live with it forever. I don't expect your forgiveness. There is no justification for this ugly crime I committed. It was selfish, cruel, and cowardly." David's application for parole was denied, mainly because David claimed he had thrown Dawn's body out with the trash rather than cooked it down as he had confessed during the investigation. The parole board stated that David had not taken full responsibility for killing Dawn, and he continued to blame her for provoking him. David will be eligible to apply for parole again in 2026. Dawn was in the prime of her life when the person she loved and trusted the most committed an act of unimaginable betrayal and cruelty. But his depravity didn't end there. He chose to desecrate not only Dawn's memory by lying and concealing her whereabouts, but also her physical remains by destroying her body. The final words of this story belong to Dana, Dawn's big sister, who continues to suffer due to David's refusal to own the story which he already confessed to. She stated, "There's no happy ending. 2 families have suffered tremendously. This is a man I've known for 20 years who was like a father to me. As I sat here the last hours listening, I learned I will never have any peace for a very long time. I don't feel any sympathy, nor pity, nor kindness to him whatsoever. I think he's made it pretty clear to all of us he's going to continue to fight for his freedom. If you found yourself gripped by this case and you're as eager as I am to dig deeper into others, there's a simple way to make sure you're in the loop for future episodes. Just hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This way, you'll be amongst the first to join us on our next journey into the criminal mind.